So now I'd like to talk about materials, V-Ray materials. Um, Materials make or break a rendering very quickly. If your materials look unrealistic or lack realism in things like reflections or transparency, then the scene, no matter how well lit it is or how well modeled it is, will just not look as good. So basically, what we're going to do is for every large surface that would have some type of reflective quality on it, like glass or the floor or the glass table, things like that, we are going to apply V-Ray materials. Okay, so whenever we have the opportunity to use V-Ray materials, we should try to take advantage. And there are plenty of built-in materials that come with V-Ray that we don't have to do any tweaking to, although it allows it. And I'm also going to show you how to, instead of replacing a SketchUp material, if you happen to like a SketchUp material, you can add parameters to it to make it behave like a V-Ray material. So the first thing I want to look at is replacing my glass material. So let's open up the V-Ray asset editor, and currently we are on the SketchUp glass, and I would rather use a V-Ray glass. So there's quite a decent list of different types of glass, but I'm going to recommend that whenever it's especially a window, if you're going to be replacing a window material, use uh, the material that has the word window in the title. These are glass, yes, but they have slight different parameters that won't um, allow it to behave like a window would, as well as these materials down here with the word window in their name. You can pick one with some color tint to it, but just be aware that any light passing through it, like your sun or whatever, will be altered based on the tone of the glass that you choose. So I'm going to choose a neutral by right-clicking on it and saying Add to Scene. Could have also, oh, why do I have two? I'm not sure. Let's delete that. I'm going to delete it. Just named it number 2. It's interesting. Okay. Another way to do that instead of right-clicking is just drag it and pull it over into the scene. Okay. So we only want one. Now I want to apply this material to some of the glass objects in my scene. And if I select one, like this window here, and right click on it and say apply to selection, then that will put it into my SketchUp material list. And I can now see it over here, glass window neutral. Wait, why does it say 1? Not sure. Anyway, so let's drag this out. That's the only one. Okay, so that is my material. And if I wanted to apply that to other places in my scene where I've got glass, I don't want everything there. So then I want the tabletop to be glass. So let's try that. And I have some glass shells over here. Okay. So now that I've chosen to use a more realistic material, um, especially for night scenes, glass really becomes important because the one quality that glass has that we take for granted is how reflective it is. So if I were to render this scene now, which before had dead blue glass in it, and for some reason it's still showing up as dead blue. Let me stop that. I want to check why. Let's try one more time to apply my, that's better. It changed. Okay, let's try and render that again. And hopefully it's going to look a lot more realistic now. So right away we can see um, that the glass is reflecting objects in the interior, which it would, especially at night. So by using a V-Ray material there, you can see how much more impactful that glass, it actually feels like a window now. Okay, I'm not picking up the other glass as easily because over here it's not very well illuminated. I could put a spotlight over there, that would help bring it up. I can see a little bit of reflections happening on this glass here. Similarly with my glass top, if I'm not crazy about that material there, I could try using a bit more of a tint, like a tempered glass. Let's try that and apply that to our table by right-clicking, apply to selection. Can't tell if it changed or not. Let's see. Glass tempered. Yeah, maybe it did. Okay. So if I were to render it now, that glass might look a little bit different. Might have a bit of color to it, like coffee tables and things like that often do. So in that case, because it's a thicker type of glass, maybe I would prefer to use something with a little more character to it than just clear glass. Okay, so we'll let that render out just to see if it's working the way I expect. And yeah, it's starting to feel a little bit more like a tinted glass table. Okay, so that's how we can pick a V-Ray material and apply it into our scene. Okay, um, and I do highly recommend using things like the metals for things like chrome. Like if I were to change these metal parts of the sofa and the legs of the table into some kind of aluminum or something glossy or chrome-like. Let's see, what do we have? Could go with something more polished. Something with a little bit of a character to it. I don't mind that. So if I were to now take my sofa, the thing with the V-Ray metals, when they're in the scene, they will often show up as black. So don't be alarmed if they don't show a color to them and they just show up as black. A lot of the metals have that quality to them. So is this the right? No, there we go. I could apply that even to things like the frame around the fireplace. The handles on the cabinets. And so on. Okay, so I'm going to render that now. I guess I could have done the legs of the chair as well, but you'll see that it's going to start to look a lot more interesting. Things like the frames on the artwork and so on. So it's those little details that if we pay attention to those types of things, they start to look a lot more realistic. Okay, and try different ones. Right now, because my rendering settings are so low, it's hard to really appreciate how good that metal looks. But I could try different metals on different surfaces. Maybe the frame around the TV, I could do in something interesting, and so on. Okay, so let's say I really like this wood flooring and I want to keep it, and I don't want to switch it to a V-Ray material, but I want it to have a reflection. So how can I do that? If I go into my material editor and I choose the wood floor, if I click on the quick setting dialog, you'll see that it's a generic material type. And if I were to pick something in here, then that would turn it into um, a different kind of material, which may or may not come in handy. I could have possibly done that with my blue glass, just changed it to a glass material. It still would have had a heavy blue tint to it, which is why I didn't do it that way. But another way to have these materials show up more like a V-Ray material is to work with the parameters that are already given. So I'm concerned with the reflection. Okay, so if I were to turn this up, you can see I've got a nice polished reflective quality to my material, but unless it's like a super glossy piece of wood, that's not going to look realistic either. So there are more parameters that I can adjust over here, which will help me take it back into a more realistic type material. The number one thing is the reflection glossiness. Currently is set to a full value of 1. If I were to reduce that to something like 0.8, then my reflection starts to get blurrier, and that's a lot more realistic. So if I go too low, though, like to something like 0.5, it almost makes the reflection too blurry, and it doesn't even feel reflective. So generally, I'm going to say something like 0.75 or 0.8 or 0.85, somewhere in that vicinity will give you some pretty decent results. So let's have a quick rendering. I'm going to focus over here where I know I can see something reflected on it. So if I were to draw a square around this part of my scene and render it, and hopefully the reflectivity will show up and we'll get a different sense. Again, we don't want things to be too strong because then it's not realistic either. Maybe a little bit stronger than that. If I were to reduce the blurriness to say 0.9, maybe that will help. And no, I'll leave the Fresnel on. And again, just by playing with these different things, sometimes you'll kind of scare yourself. Oh, that's not what I want. But often it'll give you closer to the effect that you're looking for. So by playing with the parameters, you can come up with some more realistic materials. Another way to adjust these materials to be more like V-Ray materials would be to look at the parameters of a material. So let's say we were to choose a V-Ray wood material, and if I look through the pictures and choose a reflective quality that I like maybe I like this one because it's similar to what I already have. If I were to drag it into my scene, if I were to look at the parameters of what they use in their settings, like 0.75, and it's a blend value, and so on and so forth, by copying or imitating a lot of the settings that they've used, then often we can imitate the materials if we don't want to use the exact material that's currently in V-Ray. So there's lots of different ways of going about using the V-Ray materials for our purposes. Okay, But pay attention, this little light up here is put in there just to show you um, the quality of the reflection on the material. Okay, so if you were to go with something dark like this for the flooring, which is popular, so if you were to apply that to the selection, close that out, and did it apply? Yes. Okay. So if I were to render that now, obviously the wood's going to change to a very dark material, but there's one thing I want to point out is we will completely lose the detail that is in the material compared to what it looks like in the list. And that's because, let me call it back up, you'll notice that it's called laminate D02, 120 centimeters. So what that's saying is this picture that they're using to represent the wood grain should have a size in SketchUp of 120 centimeters. So if I were to click and edit that material, you'll notice that the setting defaults to 10 inches. But if I were to type in 120 centimeters, now it's going to render to the correct size in my scene. So hopefully I can get it to show up. It is pretty dark. So yes, now we're starting to see some of the grain pattern showing up. Still pretty blurry on our settings, but put it up to low. Should look a little better. So that's a very important consideration whenever we're bringing in a material that has a size in the title in the V-Ray list. Make sure that you come over here to the SketchUp materials and adjust it to be the same, because if you don't, the map is often too small for you to even notice any of the details. So that's a really basic introduction to materials, and hopefully that will help you apply them better in your scene.